I'm Brad Stone in San Francisco, filling in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Netflix, the first of big tech to report earnings. Third quarter subscriber growth lifted its shares and impressed. Can the rest of the FANG family do the same? Plus, know your internet rights, how Congressman Ro Khanna wants to protect people online. Can his Internet Bill of Rights become the law of the land? And less than 3 weeks till midterms, getting out the vote with data and celebrity-driven voter registration. But first to our top story. The NASDAQ has seen its fair share of wild days so far in October, and there's still some time to go. As earnings season picks up steam, investors are sifting through results for signs of strength and weakness to see whether the ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China, as well as higher interest rates, are eating away at profits. Earlier this week, we saw Netflix report a strong third quarter. The streaming giant signed up 6.9 billion customers, boosting its global total to 137 million customers. So can this blistering growth be enough to lift the family of FANG stocks as they try to rebound from a recent global equity sell-off? Joining us to discuss, Michael Pachter, Wedbush Managing Director, as well as Bloomberg's Luke Hawa. Michael, let's start with you. The FANG stocks are usually buoyed by the first to report good earnings. It didn't really happen this week. What's going on?
Clearly each reflects the overall economy and each is global. Netflix in particular, though, has been a content story. And as their content gets better, and especially up against a pretty easy comparison a year ago, they see subscribers join. And I think really more realistically, they see fewer people quit. They've gotten to the critical mass on content where they keep something coming out virtually every week. And so it really keeps their subscribers happy. They tend to churn less, which drives the overall net ad. That's not the same story for the guys who are advertising dependent. They're far more sensitive, to the global economy. So I think when people talk about a looming trade war with China, there's concern that perhaps that throws the U.S. and the globe into recession, which means that you'll see a depression of ad spend. So different for Netflix than the other guys.
Luke, what are you seeing? Is this related to anxiety around advertising, or are there also some macro factors here, like worries about a trade war, interest rates, and the situation with Saudi Arabia?
I'm sure the macro factors are playing somewhat of a role here, but for me the real story is that lack of halo effect in terms of Netflix's strong results not really rubbing off on the rest of the FANG group. And the part of that story is really related to something more technical in markets. It's an ongoing factor rotation we're seeing. So, the FANG group is all part of what we like to call momentum stocks that generally have had strong uptrends, and you bet that the market winners will keep on winning. The stock tumult that we've seen in recent weeks has also been associated with a factor rotation to value stocks over momentum. And what you see in the market right now is on an intraday basis, momentum and value are trading off day by day, hour by hour, back and forth. So it's a listless market searching for what the direction and what the leadership will be. And that's why I think the upcoming earnings from the rest of the big tech group will be very important to resolve the shape of the market and determine market leadership from here out.
Well, let's take these companies one by one. We have a pile-up of earnings over the next 10 days. Michael, including Amazon on Thursday. This quarter is going to reflect Prime Day. They've had a couple of quarters where they're showing, really for Amazon, surprising amounts of profit per share. So what are you expecting from Jeff Bezos and company next week?
They turned on a dime from kind of stumbling in 2014. They were growing their spending faster than they were growing their gross profit dollars. And after 2014, they started just spending a little bit less. We have them generating about $25 billion of gross profit growth in 2018 compared to 2017, and spending about $21 billion of that, which leaves $4 billion to drop to the bottom line. When you only have 500 million shares, it's pretty easy to generate massive earnings growth. So first half this year, they've thrown off over $8 a share in EPS. Last year, under $2. I think that trend continues. And I think you're right. Prime Day was a big driver. Amazon, to coin a very famous author's term, really is the everything store. And they sell everything. And this is where we go. Our default searches now for products are on Amazon. We used to search on Google. So that's the one that I think is going to stand out. I don't think they can miss.
Thank you for that, Michael. Luke, let me ask you about Facebook. So much controversy, particularly with, fake news and voter suppression efforts ahead of the midterms. And yet analysts seem to be worried about something more trivial, which is, margin compression and the rise of operating expenses. What are you expecting from Facebook a week from Tuesday?
Well, that's hardly trivial to analysts. I think that's what really matters in terms of the stock's profitability and whether you want to own it. I don't think Facebook is a moral theater for a lot of people. It's a profit center. And to that point, I think across the board with the FANG stocks, what we're seeing is people are pricing in bigger implied moves from options this earnings season than they have in the previous 3 on average. And with regards to Facebook's margins, it's interesting because they have a tendency is they start off the year with relatively high expense guidance, and then they tend to trim that as the year goes on. This has been a departure from the norm in this year. So on the one end, you have the creeping expenses, which are in part associated with kind of your fake news monitoring costs. And on the other hand, you have the potential for less targeting abilities to crimp margins on the upper end too, in terms of what you're able to promise to ad providers. To a large extent, I believe that analysts think Facebook is able to offset that by virtue of having a lower ad load, kind of cleaning up the news feed, and being able to command a premium on lower volume.
Michael, let me ask you about Google. It's had kind of a miserable couple of months in terms of the stock price. Clearly worries about government intervention, rising marketing expenses. I've heard you be more bullish, though, about Google's long-term potential. So what are you expecting next Thursday from Google?
I've been covering them a whopping 2 days, so I'm far from an expert. I think the street's got it wrong on this quarter, and I think the thing to look at is the top line is expected to grow sequentially over $1 billion. The street has them at 1.35 billion. We have them at 1.6 billion, and the street thinks we're going to see a sequential decline in EPS. I don't see how that's possible. The company warned that marketing expense would be higher, but the street has marketing expense literally something like $1 billion higher sequentially. That's just crazy talk. So I think Google is going to blow numbers away. I think they figured out the formula, which is don't spend all of your profit and investors will reward you and their share price will go up. They pay their employees in stock. Everybody, who's a constituent of Google cares about the share price. So I think they're going to blow numbers away. The ad market's super strong. Google is really diverse, beyond search. I mean, they clearly are on mobile. They've got the map function. They've got YouTube. They are hitting on all cylinders. So I think you're going to get a nice positive surprise.
Michael, really quick question. Why China? Why this Dragonfly project and taking on such regulatory and reputational risk? I mean, is Google running out of big markets?
Well, everybody would love to be in China. It's obviously a very large economy. And, I think that you're right. I mean, it's a trade-off risk-reward. Risk is huge. Reward is huge. I think Google thinks they can dominate that market. So I think that they're willing to take the regulatory risk. I think they're willing to take the reputational risk. And I agree with you. If they misexecute, it's going to be a huge, huge black mark. Let's hope they figure it out, or let's hope they move very slowly and don't screw up. I think the only thing that'll trip them up is if they try to go too fast.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Wedbush Managing Director Michael Pachter and Luke Howe of Bloomberg News, thank you both very much. Coming up, Saudi Arabia and its big bet on tech, but will a journalist's disappearance strain its relations with Silicon Valley? We discuss next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. One of the latest developments in the disappearance of journalist Jamal Khashoggi is Twitter shutting down a network of bots appearing to push pro-Saudi talking points. That's according to NBC News. The report says hundreds of accounts simultaneously retweeted pro-Saudi government tweets. Turkey says Khashoggi was murdered by people tied to the Saudi government when he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd. Saudi Arabia denies the charges. And this had led to plenty of high-profile execs dropping out of a Saudi event in Riyadh. Among them, Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi, whose company has benefited from billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia. Despite the dropouts, the Saudi Future Investment Initiative has issued a statement saying they will still proceed with the conference with an updated program. Here to discuss, Lane Kesselman, managing partner at Greenbrier. Before that, he was Uber's head of U.S. comms. Also with us, Bloomberg Tech's Selena Wang. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks.
Lane, let's start with you. I'm imagining SoftBank CEO Masayoshi Son sitting in an empty room next week in Riyadh. From your perspective, what kind of a position is he in right now? A major partner of the Saudi Public Pension Fund, and yet, here he is basically somewhat abandoned by all the other Silicon Valley CEOs.
I think folks in positions of great authority and power like that have the ability to look at things from a pretty broad perspective. And in this case, looking at the Saudis' investment habits over the past decade has been pretty impressive, right? They've been involved in deals from small, $100 million deals with Tesla to multi-billion-dollar deals with Uber. I think the reality is those types of deals have been happening despite what the Saudis have been doing as a country for the past decade. I think he's got the benefit of perspective to be able to see that over the long term.
Selena, is there anything Masayoshi Son can do right now? The Saudi Arabia is responsible for about half of the Vision Fund, right? And
right.
is potentially re-upping for a second one. What is he contractually able to do, even if he wanted to?
It's extremely precarious position right now. Not only just $45 billion for this current fund, but they've committed $45 billion to the upcoming fund. And Son said in an interview with us just last month that he plans to raise $100 billion every 2 to 3 years. And of course, he can diversify and find other places to raise capital, but it's a very unique place, this Saudi Arabian fund, where he can get such a large pool of capital every few years potentially. So this could really throw his entire fund out of whack. One of the main theses of the Vision Fund is that they have essentially unlimited capital to pour into these companies. So it's going to be a really difficult calculus for him in terms of what he does in terms of signaling for attending this conference and relationships with the Saudi Arabian government in the future.
Lane, the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, it feels visceral to me. It feels like people are reacting to it in a way that they didn't perhaps other perceived outrages alleged by the Saudi government. And you seem to be saying that perhaps this blows over, that in the long term it might not impact as much the Saudi role in the tech ecosystem?
Well, if you look at other countries and other places that have committed terrible atrocities or done things that are sort of, by American standards, awful, China jails dissidents who complain about the government online. The U.S. In-Q-Tel, right, the largest VC for our intelligence agencies, funds companies all over the valley. Nobody's turning away the money from the Chinese.
They're not assassinating journalists in foreign embassies.
Is the CIA assassinating journalists in another country? They might be. I don't know any details about that. But the reality is the U.S. government has been killing people all over the world for decades, but we don't turn down their money. And the Chinese haven't necessarily been the best actors when it comes to certainly even the media or folks that are bloggers in their country. Yet their money is coming in droves to Silicon Valley. So I do think that we'll probably get to a point soon where maybe looking down on Saudi money becomes less of a bad thing.
Well, Selena, how do you feel about that? If you're an employee at Uber right now, you have an IPO, perhaps next year. It seems like early next year. And yet, Uber has taken billions of dollars of Saudi money. If are employees uncomfortable, do you think?
Well, I think public outrage is at an all-time high, and we're in a different era where tech employees in the community really care about who's backing their companies. Where is this money coming from? And we saw, earlier this year, Google had to not renew a contract with the Defense Department. They've come under huge backlash from the government and their own employees over this project in China to create a censored algorithm. So I think while it is correct what Lane says, that this isn't the first time that a regime that's done some terrible acts has funded tech companies, I really think we're in a different time right now.
Yeah, and we should clarify, right, that we don't know that the CIA is assassinating journalists. But, Selena's point is right. It reminds me of like the attitude in universities in the early 90s where students were asking schools to divest from South Africa over apartheid. are we seeing an awakening, do you think, among tech employees? Could they make their voices heard on this issue in a way perhaps we're not anticipating?
I mean, we should reiterate the fact that any journalist has been assassinated for their work or their coverage is awful and is an atrocity and is something that we should focus on. But the reality is the Saudis have been heavily involved in, frankly, countries all throughout the Middle East that have wealth from oil have been involved in Silicon Valley for more than a decade. If you go to a venture capital training program at Stanford right now, a third of the class is Saudi, right? And so the Saudi royal family has been investing in various venture capital funds for a decade. So it's not like any money that we sort of decide to not take from the sovereign wealth fund is any different than sort of the fruit of the poisonous tree from taking money from another VC fund that may just have money from one of the members of the Saudi royal family. So I don't know that you can really separate that web any more than just turning down money from one source.
Any idea if the Saudi royal family will be forced to, make a change in leadership in response to some of these concerns?
I mean, that's I think the big question everybody's wondering right now. I don't have any insight into that any more than maybe you do, but I do think it's probably a pretty big question that a lot of folks are asking.
Yeah. So slightly different topic. An Uber IPO is rumored for early next year. There has been some, news that Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs competing to lead that IPO. Your former colleagues at Uber, how excited are they? How dependent are they on this happening soon rather than later?
Brad, what's so interesting is that a year ago, most Uber employees were chatting a lot of Uber alumni were chatting a lot about an IPO. When is it going to happen? What's the number going to be? But then there were 2 tender offers. And so I think the intensity and need for an IPO to happen diminished a little bit. So I think employees are watching, and certainly former employees are paying attention to it. But like most tech companies, there's a 6-month lockout for employees. And if you sort of look at Facebook as a good barometer,
they had a tough time of it early on.
I mean, a year after it IPO'd, it was probably half the value that it IPO'd at. So I don't know that there's a ton of excitement, but I think, of course, everybody wants to get to the next stage.
Okay, thanks to you both. Lane Kesselman of Greenbrier Partners and Bloomberg's Selena Wang, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
We should note that Bloomberg is among the media partners who have pulled out of the Saudi Future Investment Initiative. Coming up, Atlassian's Jira Cloud software is its biggest product. But as the cloud space becomes more and more competitive, will a push into IT manage to keep it afloat? And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Competition in the cloud space is heating up as Amazon, Microsoft, and Google muscle in and take more and more market share. That's making it tough for the smaller players. Australian software maker Atlassian has managed to keep up so far. The company posted first quarter fiscal 2019 earnings that beat estimates, reporting 37% year-over-year increase in quarterly revenue to $267.3 million. But investors have reacted negatively, with shares falling as much as 15%. What's the long-term future for smaller players in the cloud space? Here to discuss, Atlassian President Jay Simons. Jay, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So talk about that discrepancy. Good earnings, a beat, and yet the share price dropped slightly.
Man, it's hard for me to predict what the market will do. I mean, and we don't focus on the day, we focus on the decade. And we focus on the things we can control, which is like building better software that more and more people want to buy, that produces the results that we reported.
But part of the reaction was to some debt obligations, right?
That they may have misunderstood, yeah.
Well, how so?
It's basically a charge, that we mark to market, and the stock has had incredible performance over the past, especially the past handful of months, and so we recognize that charge related to convertible debt that we raised 4 months ago.
Okay, so lots else going on in your business. You acquired a company called OpsGenie that makes it easier for companies to manage IT disruptions. Talk about that and how the integration is going.
Yeah, so we signaled 3 months ago intent to kind of widen the aperture on the problems that we solve for IT. And a big a problem that IT organizations everywhere are facing is sort of responding to incidents and dealing with incidents. As more and more companies become digital companies, that impact actually means that most companies are managing a service for their customers or employees. And so OpsGenie is a really important part of the alerting and rostering of people who will be on duty to respond to that incident. We also announced a new product called Jira Ops, which becomes sort of a command center for all of the coordination of people, process, workflow that helps companies respond faster to incidents for their customers.
Okay, so a little bit of an earthquake in your business in June when Microsoft acquired GitHub. How does that change the competitive landscape for Atlassian?
Not really. It wasn't really an earthquake. I mean, GitHub is a great product, and it's something that we've both integrated to and competed against. GitHub largely is transformed the way the open source software is shared on the internet, for individual developers. And so where you want to find a piece of code, largely that code now is hosted on GitHub, which I think makes it a very attractive asset for a company like Microsoft that also has an infrastructure platform called Azure, where you ultimately want that code to run. We're focused on, with Bitbucket, our product, more professional code collaboration. And so teams that actually want a similar experience to GitHub on the internet, but want the security and reliability of a piece of enterprise software, choose Bitbucket.
Well, we reported, and others did as well, that Google was also interested in buying GitHub. Does the fact that it lost out on that acquisition make Atlassian, with its GitHub product, like maybe more of a compelling acquisition potentially to a company like Google?
Bitbucket, you'd have to ask Google. But I think it's sort of telling you that Google, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, I think are in a very hotly contested and a very massive, market competition for, basically the infrastructure that runs a lot of software that more and more companies are building. Our focus is on helping those companies build and run software better or faster, and I think that's testament to sort of why we've grown at the rate that we have.
Are you guys for sale now if the right partner and the right price came along?
I don't think so. I mean, we've been pretty independently run business for a long period of time, and I think we've got a lot of growth and runway in front of us. That's the thing that we're leaning into.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Atlassian President Jay Simmons, thanks for joining. Coming up, Joe Strummer saying, know your rights. Well, Congressman Ro Khanna says, know your internet rights. We find out what he's got in mind next. And we already have a celebrity president, but with 3 weeks left until midterms, are celebrities the key to online voter registration? This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Brad Stone in San Francisco, filling in for Emily Chang. Have you heard of the Internet Bill of Rights? You might soon if California Congressman Ro Khanna has anything to say about it. Representative Khanna drafted a 10-point program that will help to figure out what people's rights and responsibilities look like online, telling Bloomberg, quote, citizens need to be protected not just from government overreach, but from the overreach of corporate actors. Khanna covers California's 17th district, effectively making him the representative for Silicon Valley. He joins us now from Washington. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Brad, great to be on.
So you're Silicon Valley's representative. You have lots of friends here. So tell us what this Internet Bill of Rights is and what the reaction has been at home.
Well, the Internet Bill of Rights is a simple document to say that people's freedoms and security need to be protected online. And it has common sense provisions. Individuals should know what's happening to their data. Just like you know what happens to your health data, you know what happens to your financial data on a credit check, you should know what happens to the data you have online. You should be notified if there's a breach. You should have to be able to consent before your data is collected. And it's gotten a very good reception. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee, who was the founder of the World Wide Web, helped with it, supported it. And many tech leaders understand that we need well-crafted regulation.
The European Union has gone a little bit farther and certainly acted a little bit sooner on privacy regulations like this, and in particular, the right to be forgotten, right? The right of any European citizen to say, take me off your search engine. Is this Internet Bill of Rights doing the same thing?
No, it's not. First of all, we have a First Amendment in the United States, so the right to be forgotten would be unconstitutional. If I don't like this interview, 5 years from now, I shouldn't just be able to say, delete it from the internet because it doesn't make me look good. And that's what the right to be forgotten is. It would be unconstitutional. Also, Europe has consent required in every use case. So if you go to a European website, anytime you see an ad, you have to click consent, which means users are having to click consent 20, 30 times in a day. It's overly broad. It's overly prescriptive. And Europe hasn't rivaled America's innovation. I mean, they have, a few tech companies that have emerged there. They don't have the innovation we do. So this is more inconsistent with our Constitution. It's pro-innovation, but it's saying that we do need some basic protections here in the American context.
I was particularly interested by point number 6 in your bill, which is really a net neutrality provision saying that internet users should be free to access the internet without encountering throttling or paid prioritization. Of course, the Trump FCC has a limited net neutrality provision. So would that override the FCC, or how would it jibe with what has been resistance from the Trump administration?
You're absolutely right. It is a net neutrality provision. Tom Wheeler, who was the FCC chair under Obama, had a net neutrality provision with the FCC that I thought was very, very strong. Ajit Pai, the Trump's nominee, has repealed it. And what we want to see is not ping-ponging back and forth on net neutrality from administration to administration. We should have Congress pass a statute, a law that says net neutrality is required. And that's what the Internet Bill of Rights would do. If we do take back Congress, the Democrats should work with reasonable Republicans to get net neutrality in statute.
So as you said, you have consulted with some deep thinkers in the tech world as you prepared this Bill of Rights. I'm curious to what extent are you holding tech companies to account, and to what extent are you also protecting them from what could be kind of more intrusive or restrictive regulation, or is the point to really do a little bit of both?
That's a very fair question. I mean, it certainly is holding tech companies to account because right now they don't have a right to notify in a case of a breach. We saw with the Equifax breach or the Facebook breach, people weren't notified for months or years. This would require them to notify right away. Right now, they don't have to get people's consent to collect data. I mean, you have to sign a service agreement, but after that, basically they have carte blanche to get your data. This would impose a consent requirement. It would require them to tell you what they're doing with their data. So it would really put a fair amount of responsibility on these tech companies. That said, it's not overbroad. It's well crafted. And the danger is if tech doesn't support well-crafted regulations, you could see more draconian measures that actually hurt innovation and that aren't careful. So my hope is that thoughtful tech leaders, people like Tim Cook, who's called for well-crafted regulation, will realize they should get on board with reasonable regulation. It doesn't have to be support for my Internet Bill of Rights, but that's a conversation starting point, and hopefully they'll engage with the Congress to get good legislation.
That was actually my next question, which is, what have you heard from the big tech companies? We've heard Tim Cook, also Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos say they would welcome regulation, that big tech companies deserve scrutiny. What has been the initial feedback to the Bill of Rights?
The feedback has been positive, but as people say, the devil is in the details. Okay, we can agree with these high-level principles, but what is the legislation going to say? How are you going to define what constitutes personal data? What does it mean to say that you have to be notified in a reasonable time period? Is that 24 hours or is that a week? What does it mean when you say you need consent before you collect data? How often do you need to consent? When do you need to consent? So I think all those questions are going to fall to the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives. The details of this legislation are really going to matter. And I hope that Congress will consult nonprofits, academics, and outside tech leaders, because I'll tell you, the expertise isn't in the building, and we need to engage with the tech community in crafting regulations that are thoughtful and make sense.
Congressman, what are the political prospects for the Internet Bill of Rights? Does it depend on a particular outcome in the midterms and perhaps, the Democrats taking either one or both branches of Congress?
I think the prospects are higher if the Democrats take over Congress because the Republicans have been in charge for 2 years and there's been no movement. I mean, think about that. After the Cambridge Analytica scandal and Zuckerberg coming and testifying and Google and Twitter coming and testifying, the Republicans haven't moved because they're largely beholden to the internet service providers, AT&T, Charter, Verizon, and they haven't made a good faith effort to propose an Internet Bill of Rights. If the Democrats are in charge, we will, I think, take reasonable regulatory steps. We're not going to demonize companies the way the Republicans are. I mean, it's absurd to say that Facebook and Google's algorithms are politically biased. The biggest beneficiary of social media has been Donald Trump. So I think some of the Republican attacks lack a knowledge of how these algorithms work. But we are, I think, going to propose reasonable regulations, and hopefully moderate Republicans would come on board.
Congressman, let me change the topic a little bit and ask you about Facebook and the upcoming elections. They recently gave reporters a tour of their war room, and they claimed some success in countering voter suppression and fake news in the run-up to the Brazilian election. Is Facebook doing enough in your mind?
Well, they didn't do enough in 2016. I think they're taking constructive steps, and they need to do even more. Look, part of me is sympathetic. They started 14 years ago with maybe 20,000, 100,000 people, and now they've grown to 2 billion people. That's a huge platform, bigger than any nation. And so to figure out how do you have controls on this to prevent incitement of violence, voter suppression, human rights abuses is a big project. What I think they need to do is hire many more people who are humanists, who are ethicists, to help them come up with standards of what requirements there should be for third-party verification, for weeding out bots, for weeding out hate speech or propaganda. I think they need to hire a lot more people and hire more humanists to work there. But I'm glad that they are taking steps, and it's a start.
One more question while I have you. I remember you being quite skeptical of Amazon's takeover of Whole Foods, of AT&T's acquisition of Time Warner. As skepticism has risen about the big tech platforms, do you think the rest of Congress is coming around to your view of antitrust?
I think there are. There's a large concern that you can't have anti-competitive mergers that hurt communities, that hurt local business, that hurt wages. And at the very least, these mergers need to be scrutinized. I helped found the Antitrust Caucus. I've been very clear that it can't just be that big is bad. You need actual review, and you need to look at what the impact is for consumers, what the impact is on jobs, what the impact is on wages, what the impact is on communities. But we need to empower the FTC and the Department of Justice to conduct those reviews, to provide those resources. I think there's a growing consensus, both on the right and the left, that we need strong antitrust laws that do their job.
Okay, Representative Ro Khanna of California, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back.
Facebook has hired Britain's former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg to run its global lobbying efforts. Clegg's taking the job at a time when governments around the world are debating how to regulate the social network. Clegg was at the heart of the British government from 2010 to 2015 as leader of the Liberal Democrats. Coming up, call it the Taylor Swift effect, how celebrity-endorsed social media posts could impact the vote. Drive AI is launching its second self-driving car service in months. At that speed, could entirely driverless roads be in the near future? This is Bloomberg. The midterms are less than 3 weeks away, and if the past is a predictor of future behavior, only 40% of eligible voters will vote this election. Vote.org is on a mission to help change that. In 2018, the organization used data-driven strategies to reach a milestone by registering more than 1 million voters nationwide. Here to discuss is Deborah Cleaver, founder and CEO of Vote.org. Deborah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So how do the midterms, now 18 days away, look to you?
That is such an interesting question. I would say that we have seen record interest in the midterm elections, especially from people under 30.
What are you guys doing differently this time around?
Okay, so I would say that in 2016, we ran a pretty large program. This year, we're reaching 10 times the number of voters, both on the website itself and via proactive outreach. And we have also partnered with celebrities, including Taylor Swift and Barack Obama, to help us reach even more people.
That Taylor Swift Instagram post, I mean, I was amazed at the impact it seemed to have, right? What does that tell us about the current environment of motivating people to get to the polls?
It would be hard to overstate the impact that the Taylor Swift post had. We saw record traffic. We registered 300,000 people within 72 hours of the post, and the majority of them are under 30, which is very unusual.
Now, on the other end of the celebrity spectrum, yesterday, Elle magazine tweeted that Kanye and Kim had broken up, and of course, if you clicked on the link, it took you to a voter registration page. Effective, perhaps, because I believe I might have clicked on it. But what does that tell us maybe about what works and sometimes the overreach?
I wouldn't say it's overreach. I would say it's pretty lighthearted. We have found it honestly to be pretty hilarious. We're calling it vote rolling, which is a riff on Rick rolling. And you know what? It's been really effective. I mean, there was a Taylor Swift bump, and then there was an even bigger bump from the vote rolling, and whatever it takes to get people to the polls. I think it's lighthearted.
What was there was some outrage there. Was that misplaced or perhaps facetious?
I would say that it was a little bit misplaced. There are other things that we should be outraged about. A little bit of fun on the internet. That's just called the internet.
So what's not working this time around? What's less effective? Is it conventional advertising on TV to try to get people to register?
Yes, actually, broadcast TV has been ineffective for quite some time, but we've reached a point where 50% of people under 50 haven't seen a minute of broadcast TV in a year. So if you're running a commercial, you're just not going to reach anyone under 50. What is working is anything that isn't broadcast television, including vote rolling.
Well, let's talk about the legal landscape, because there are a lot of states that have instant registration, online registration. There are states that mandate companies to give people time off to go vote, but not everywhere, right? So how far are we in laws that basically facilitate easy registration and voting?
So a handful of states have automatic voter registration, which is the gold standard of registration.
That's any time you deal with the state government you're in.
Automatically registered to vote, which is great. It's a cost savings, and why should people have to go out of their way to register to vote when they're already dealing with the government? On the other end, 50% of states don't require that your employer give you paid time off to vote. So a number of Americans, a significant percentage, need to choose between voting and collecting a paycheck.
Okay, Deborah Cleaver, founder and CEO of Vote.org, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The U.S. has charged a Russian national for allegedly being one of the masterminds behind election interference in the 2016 presidential election and the upcoming 2018 elections. The Justice Department says Elena Kushyanova was the accountant for Project Latka, which used thousands of social media and email accounts. The conspirators allegedly referred to the effort as, quote, information warfare against the United States. Joining us to break down the news is Chief Washington Correspondent Kevin Cirilli. Kevin, thank you for joining us. I butchered the alleged suspect's name there, but what can you tell her about? What can you tell us about what the government is charging her with?
Elena Alexievna Kushyanova is charged with trying to get infiltrating the U.S. midterm elections, the upcoming ones in 2018, as well as the previous iteration in 2016. This is big news because, of course, this comes just 17 days ahead of the midterm elections. It also comes as the intelligence community has been working with state and local elections commissions and offices nationwide, as well as the private sector, big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, about how to better protect protect U.S. companies and U.S. voters from these actions. It also, of course, comes as Bob Mueller's investigation is also investigating into a host of ranging of these issues. This is a separate charge from the Department of Justice. It's not technically related to the Mueller probe. We should note that. But it really comes at a time in which tech companies are facing questions about how they are communicating and working and cooperating, not just with the federal level, folks at the FBI, folks at the intelligence community, but also the state level. So this shows that the Russians are still very much trying to use American platforms to spread propaganda, to spread disinformation, to confuse American voters in this midterm election cycle.
Kevin, the federal government has charged other Russians with election tampering. Was this one plot? Was it several plots? And what do we know about the ties to the government of Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's part of a broader trend that we've seen. Now, the Russian president has denied all of this, but I mean, facts speak for themselves. And the facts are that if you look at the intelligence community briefings and reports that have come out within the past several year or two since the presidential election in 2016, that there was a concerted effort to use American platforms, American-based platforms, to spread propaganda, to spread disinformation, to divide Americans on a host of different issues. So what this would suggest is that this fits into that type of disinformation strategy. Now, this is a potential issue for the current administration, given that President Trump, of course, has noted several times, and I want to note this in Chris Strom's Bloomberg report as well, that this was not an attack on election systems. This was not a way to change a vote count. Instead, it was this broader sense of disinformation that have been used on a host of social media platforms. Facebook, we should note, has also reported that there has been in the last couple of months some effort on foreign nationals to spread disinformation. They've been shutting down accounts. They've been working with federal level. They've been having calls with local election officials as well. And this is something, unfortunately, that I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about between now and the midterm elections.
Okay, Kevin Cirilli, Chief Washington Correspondent. We'll be watching that closely. Thank you. Coming up, self-driving cars are hitting the roads of Texas, but how long until they reach the rest of the U.S.? Next. This is Bloomberg. While companies like Uber and Waymo race to get their self-driving car programs off the ground, California's Drive AI is gaining speed. Today, Drive AI is launching a public on-demand ride-hailing self-driving car service in Arlington, Texas, marking its second public deployment in just 4 months. The service, which will be open to visitors and residents alike, comes through a partnership with the city to better understand and measure the self-driving car landscape. Here to tell us more is Drive AI CEO Bijit Haldi. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So Arlington, Texas, tell us what you're launching, how many cars, how widespread will it be?
So in Arlington, we are launching 3 different services. One for the game day, one for lunchtime service, and one that connects the convention center to the Texas Life, the entertainment part of the city. And to start with today, the service is starting today. We're starting with 3 cars with the potential to expand as the need and demand for the local community grows.
And what kind of cars are they?
They'll be the same car as we had in Frisco. It's an NV200 platform.
Frisco and the Dallas-Fort Worth.
Dallas-Fort Worth area.
So 3 cars, that doesn't seem huge, but it's the beginning.
It's the beginning. And as we want to tell you, the size is only one way of looking at it. We want to be very careful and deliberate because safety is another concern. And user acceptability is core concern. We start small and grow fast.
How much do riders pay?
Riders pay nothing. And anybody in that area can access this service. In Frisco, we had only mobile app. In Arlington, we have a mobile app and a kiosk and the pickup location. You can go up to the kiosk and enter your name and your phone number, and you can get it.
How long is the path between 3 cars here and, the dream of anyone in any city, hailing a driverless car?
Actually, that depends on 3 factors. Because safety is one thing. Can we safely deploy? And as you know, the second factor, driving is not a one problem. Driving in San Francisco and in freeway are 2 different problems. So we want to make sure that we take a small problem and solve it and then grow from there. To that vision, it will require third component, regulatory as well as the user acceptance. We don't want to push the technology when the people are not ready. We want to solve one problem at a time and grow from there.
So you have found a friendly local government here in Texas, but stepping back, how do you compare the regulatory environment in the U.S. versus, say, China, where there are several companies that have active trials in cities?
Yes, so regulatory environment is only one aspect, and some countries are way ahead of other countries, but the real problem is that the safety. Even if the regulation is not there, as a company, as an industry, we have to be responsible, deliberate. How do we approach it? Because there are certain approaches where we think regulation is a hindrance. We look at right regulation is the right way of approaching it. So Texas is not friendly in the sense of they are not aware of safety. They are only saying that they are future looking, that how do we balance future need and today's progress.
Okay, we're both followers of Uber. Uber, of course, one of the companies betting big on self-driving cars. Do you think as they move to go public that they will, as has been rumored, welcome other investments, spin off the self-driving car division?
As you said, I always look at the industry and other people doing it, but I cannot comment on anything specific to a company because I have no insider information. You might.
Okay, I understand. Drive AI's Bijat Halder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. And tune in for the best of Bloomberg Technology this weekend, where you can see our interview with Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. I'm Brad Stone. This is Bloomberg.